This episode of Gators Breakdown is brought to you by Eagle Energy, a quick, simple, and energy boost on the go. Try the plant-based caffeine inhaler at Eagle Energy, Eagle.energy, and use promo code Gators20 for 20% off. And also brought to you by MyBookie. Go bet with MyBookie. Sign up at mybookie.ag and use promo code Gators, and they will match your deposit dollar for dollar. Bet with MyBookie. And the Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SCC. And kind of a little bit different on this Sunday, Will Miles joins me for this Florida Georgia reaction episode. And you can find his work at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. Will, I think we know it's pretty simple explanation for why Florida lost. You picked Florida in your article last week, and Florida wore the white helmet. So it was just all doom and gloom there, right?
Well, people have certainly let me know on Twitter that I apparently have to pick against them the rest of the year, and I'm willing to make the sacrifice if that's what it takes to go 10-2 for the year. But hey, this was always a possibility coming in. We knew Georgia was a good team, and it was sort of interesting with the with the Alltel and the stadium seemed empty at the start. It was sort of a weird environment to start the game. But anyway, I mean, Florida had it in their hands. They were up 14-13, after that first drive of the second half. And from there, Georgia took over. And there are reasons for that. But they had their shot and just didn't get it done.
Yeah, okay. I'm not serious about the whole Will picking Florida and the white helmet thing. No, I'm not. People who know me enough knows I could care less what uniform they wear. Just go play.
Hey, yeah. I like the white helmets.
I do too. Everybody knows I do. Will, game Gators fell behind quickly 10-0. Had some early turnovers, weathered that storm. As you mentioned, took the lead right after halftime, 14-13. But eventually Georgia's just too much. When it came down to it in the second half, Georgia could make the plays and Florida couldn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, Georgia had the quarterback who could make the plays. I mean, those throws that Fromm was making, I mean, it didn't look like those were throws he was confident enough to make in the first half, at least not until that last drive of the first half. And then in the second half, he just came out chucking all over the place, and Florida didn't have an answer. I think they found something when they started going to Nauta there on that last drive of the first half, and you sort of felt it when they were driving down the field there, and Florida gave them the shot with 55 seconds left,
right.
and gave them that shot. They were to go down the field, able to stop them with a field goal, which was pretty impressive actually, considering the way they moved the ball in the second half when you think about it. But I think that was sort of where Fromm found his sea legs and was able to realize that Florida wasn't going to get to him, and that he was going to have time, and then he was going to be able to wait for his guys to come open, and then he was going to be able to isolate some of those guys in the secondary who would not have been starting first game of the year. And it is what it is.
That's right. We'll get to all of that. We'll just have a nice little summary there, and we'll get all into that here on this reaction episode the day after Georgia defeats Florida 37 to man, I forgot the score there.
36, buddy.
36, yeah. 36-17. There. I got my numbers mixed up. So, but remember, you can find Gators Breakdown on newsforjacks.com/Gators Breakdown. There you'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes as well as articles from the News for Jacks sports team. That's newsforjacks.com/Gators Breakdown. Also, find us on Google Play, Spotify, YouTube, all those, iTunes as well. All those services there, and you can listen to Gators Breakdown on all those platforms, and also find us on social media on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Will, you mentioned it, and I think the plan that Georgia planned to use was obvious on that first drive, where you saw they ran for 61 yards on that first drive, but settled for a field goal. Something happened on that drive as well, when C.J. Henderson went down, and it really affected what this Gator defense wanted to do for the most part of the game. C.J. McWilliams was targeted all day afterwards. The defensive front couldn't get pressure, and Jake Fromm made plays on plenty of third down passing situations where he has struggled all season so far. In the first 7 games, it was really Fromm who couldn't really find his way before this Florida game. 49% on third down, 6.1 yards per attempt. 2 touchdowns, 3 interceptions on the season. But versus Florida, he was 86%, 14 yards per attempt, 3 touchdowns. So the first touchdown pass was a 3rd and 13. The second was a 3rd and 2. The third touchdown pass was a 3rd and 9. So the Gators had Fromm in Georgia where they wanted him many times in this game, but with a lack of pressure, no Henderson, no Brad Stewart, no Brian Edwards out there who hasn't played the last couple of games. Fromm was able to pick apart as far as secondary, and while there were a few issues in this game, the secondary was the biggest issue for me.
Yeah, I mean it's all intertwined, right? I mean, the inability to get pressure means that your inexperienced defensive backs and less talented defensive backs are going to get exposed because Fromm doesn't have to get rid of the ball quickly. I mean, the touchdown throw to I think it was Godwin in front of Steiner. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
one-on-one, your safety against a really high-level wide receiver. The wide receiver should win that battle. The only way that defense works is if you get to the quarterback. They didn't get to the quarterback, and it was an easy touchdown. And I think therein lies, the announcers in the game were making a really big deal about Zuniga coming around the edge on some of those rushing plays, particularly on the goal line stand,
Yeah.
and that was really really impressive. But beyond that, he and Polite's name were not mentioned very much at all. They were not getting the quarterback. Only one sack, only two quarterback hurries. The sack came from Fojan Joseph coming on a blitz right up the middle on that first drive that sort of forced them into the field goal. They tried that blitz in that gap a couple other times and it got absolutely stoned. And when it did, then there was a guy open on the outside. So, I mean, Grantham was in sort of a tough situation because if you blitz, you leave your guys out on an island and they weren't necessarily winning those battles. But if you don't blitz and you don't get the Fromm, they weren't closing any of the holes in the zone either. And so, there were a couple of those third down conversions where Florida had 3-man rushes. There was one in particular, I think it was a pass in front of Sean Davis that the wide receiver was open, and that zone has to close quicker than that. It just does. Florida had a 3-man rush. You've got 8 guys dropping. You can't let a guy get wide open like that. He was wide open. It was an easy first down. So, there were issues in the secondary, sure, but there were issues up front too. I mean, LSU had no problem getting to the quarterback when they were playing them. In fact, played some of those same coverages where they had 3 guys rushing and dropped 8, but the 3 men were able to get to Fromm. That didn't happen yesterday. And then LSU also got there on some blitzes, some unique blitzes, made him get the ball out quickly, all sorts of things like that. I don't ever remember a guy being in his face when Fromm was throwing the ball. The only play I remember where he ever got bothered was the play by Joseph on the first drive. Other than that, he just sat back there and didn't get harassed at all. And you can blame the defensive backs for giving up a lot of yards through the air. And I think there are places where you can pick them out and say, yeah, that's their fault. But I mean, at the end of the day, when you get no pressure, you're going to get lit up. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, we've known that's what this defense has lived off of this year is that pressure they've been able to bring mostly from Polite and Zuniga, and then randomly, Chauncey Gardner Johnson or one of the corners or Rashawn Joseph, like you mentioned. And look, when we went back, Will, during the bye week, and we talked about where we wanted to see this team improved, and I said that second corner spot. Well, that second spot became the first spot, and then we never really saw the lack of depth there, and the lack of depth, the lack of pressure up front was just not a good combo. Will, as we saw Ja'Kai Polite's streak of 5 games in a row with a sack come to an end, at the worst time it could have. The Gators defense was really off balance most of the day, from what I could gather too. There, they didn't bring blitzes a lot, but when they did, as you mentioned, it was stonewalled. Georgia did a good job of adjusting to it, and they just did a good job of protecting Fromm all day, made him comfortable. As you said, it did take a while. I mean, it did seem like after the first or right going into halftime. And luckily, too, it didn't matter in the end. But Kirby was pretty conservative there. They had one. I thought I had one time. I thought they had enough time left to hit one more play there, but set up for a field goal after the timeout. But kept Florida in the game with that conservative call in there. But it was really they were probably waiting to see what they could get on that first play, and with Notto wide open and getting a whole lot of yards, just no pressure, uncovered tight end, and they just marched right down the field. And like you said, that probably was a little spark and probably a little bit of them noticing something that they could take advantage of throughout the rest of the game.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting when you look at who actually was responsible. When you go back and look at the tape for who was responsible for the broken plays. I mean, I know people are going to talk about Henderson, and I'm sure that changed the way that Grantham called the game. But it was guys who've been in there all along. The only guy who got burned for one explosive play was McWilliams, got burned for a 22-yard pass to Riley Ridley, but that was basically after the game was over. I mean, that was on the last drive of the game, or the last touchdown drive of the game for Georgia. At that point, it's already 29-17. The game pretty much felt over, even if they'd have just sat on the ball. But Voshon Joseph was responsible for 3 of them, so he missed a tackle on a run by Swift. He completely blew the coverage on that one to Nauta. That was man-to-man, and I'm pretty sure that was Joseph's man. And then there was another pass to Nauta over the middle, and that was just a really nice throw by Fromm, where Joseph was the underneath linebacker and couldn't quite get up to tip the ball, and it was a really nice throw. But so Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was involved in 2 of those, and then Steiner was involved in a couple as well. So those are guys who've been out on the field all year. You can make some comments about Marco Wilson, but he's been gone for 6 games now. You can make some comments about Quincy Lenton, but he's been gone all year. I mean, the reality is the guys who were making mistakes yesterday were not just the guys who were new to the defense or new to the starters. It wasn't Trey Dean. It wasn't McWilliams for the most part. I mean, there were a couple of places where he got targeted, but you get one-on-one coverage. Sometimes the corner gets beat. I mean, that's just the reality. He made a very nice play at the end of the first half to knock down a ball that would have been a touchdown. The touchdown in the first half that went over his head, I don't think was his fault. I think that was the safety's fault. The safety sort of has deep responsibilities on that sort of coverage and didn't get deep enough. It's like, if the corner thinks he's got help and lets the wide receiver go, well, it's not really the corner's fault. The only thing you can maybe say there is if you're going to have help deep, or if you think you're going to have help deep and you get underneath, you should get up there and jam him. But, again, so
yeah, he played off for a lot of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, so again, though, I mean, they also put him on an island quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if you've got an option, if you've got a guy you really think is the weak link, don't you shade a safety over? Like, don't you give him help? And it didn't feel like it felt like there were a lot of times where they just decided they weren't going to give him help. He's out there on one-on-one coverage, and he's young, and he's quite honestly, at least from the recruiting rankings, not as talented as some of the other guys, particularly the guys that Georgia had on their side. So, but McWilliams isn't the reason that Florida lost. He's just not. And I don't even think the injury to Henderson is the reason that they lost. I mean, there are the pass to Werner to start the second half for Georgia right after Florida takes the lead. All of a sudden Fromm hits a 35-yard pass to Charlie Warner, and that was a blown coverage by Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Yeah. He was coming up to tackle a wide receiver on a little bubble screen, wasn't his man, and then the tight end ran right by him. Now, earlier in the game, Warner had come up and blocked Johnson to try to keep him from getting in there. So, he was sort of, I think, waiting for the block to come, and it didn't. But by the time he realized it, he was streaking down the field. It was 35 yards later. So, a lot of things that need to get fixed on both sides of the ball. But that's what you would expect, right? I mean, there's a reason that 95% of the writers picked Georgia to win the SEC East to start the year. They're a very good team. Florida made some mistakes. They made them pay for it.
Yep, Will. So 240 passing yards allowed, matched the most Florida has given up this season. It also gave up 240 yards against Colorado State as well. Also gave up 180 yards rushing for the 4th time in 8 games this season there. So, yeah, I mean, not only was it the passing game, it was also the run game. But kind of, as I said, I mentioned, I think Georgia wanted. I think from that first drive, we could tell they wanted to come in and run the ball, but I think they started taking advantage of the secondary once numbers got kind of dire there for Florida, and the depth just really couldn't keep up there. But we also saw that Georgia run game toward the end of the game really, with Holyfield and Swift, end up being the backbreaker when it was all said and done.
Sure, but I mean, again, Henderson went out on the first play or the first drive, right? So that entire first half until the last drive,
still played well.
Florida's defense was able to hold them in check. So, is there depth? Are there depth issues? Absolutely. That's something you, me, and Bill have been harping on for a while now, and nobody wanted to hear it during the offseason, and now they all want to hear it now that there's a loss during the season.
I guess what I was going to say there, it's probably once they got to halftime and could kind of figure out who was going to be on the field for Florida, they knew there was probably advantage they could take advantage of.
Sure, but that also then goes to what's Florida going to do for their halftime adjustments. And I think that's a place where you can definitely criticize Florida's coaching staff is, coming out of halftime, they scored that touchdown, then there was nothing. And they had no answers for Georgia on the other side of the ball. And so the adjustments that Georgia made, Florida did not have the answer to. And that's not just on the players.
Yeah. Well, were you surprised how Fromm came out and threw the ball like he did, given you really, you nailed home an article about him going into this, looking back at what he had done in the first half of the season, and what we could look for against Florida defense. And were you kind of surprised the way he was just able to, I guess, in a way, flip a switch?
Not really. I mean, in the article, I mentioned that his highs were really high
Mhm.
and his lows were about equal to what Franks had done. Was sort of the way his season has gone. Then he had the one real low against LSU, obviously, but he definitely has a higher top gear than Franks does. And so if that happened, Florida was going to struggle. But it's not as if he came out lighting it up to start with. I mean,
Yeah.
before the final drive of the first half, he was 3 of 5 for 22 yards. I mean, they had clearly just decided I mean, it almost looked like they were afraid to put the ball in his hands. There were a few times where it was like 3rd and 5, 3rd and 6, where they were running the ball. Anytime it was 3rd and 1, they were running jet sweeps and all sorts of different stuff. It was really interesting to see sort of the announcers were calling it cute, but it almost felt like they were afraid, like they couldn't run up the middle against Florida in those situations. And I'm not sure they thought they could protect him. But then once they figured out they could protect him, then they sort of the floodgates opened up. And the other thing with Fromm is that against LSU, I mean, they threw all sorts of different looks at him. They had times where they had 7 guys up in the box and they had 4 guys dropping. They had times where they had 7 guys up in the box and all 7 came. There was a lot of variation in both the looks that they gave him and then also what they did off of those looks. They had a lot of stuff where the safeties were shifting post snap. So one of the things that I highlighted is they would be sitting in what looked like a single high safety look, and then they would sprint to a place where the safeties were playing cover 2. I didn't see any of that with Florida. I didn't see them manipulating the safeties. So basically, if he saw his pre-snap read, that was where he went. And if you haven't tried to bait him into something, then he's gonna be able to be successful. The one thing I thought he did well that I haven't seen on tape yet this year is particularly that final drive of the first half, he went to his tight ends. And that's been a place where Georgia has not gone consistently all year long, and they didn't last year either. 2 years ago with Jacob Easton, they went to the tight ends a lot, but last year and this year they haven't done it, and they went to them a ton. So they went to Werner, they went to Nauta, and really those guys sort of turned the game around. Werner was key to the touchdown to take back the lead, and Nauta was key to getting that field goal at the end of the half. And Florida didn't really have an answer for either one.
All right, well, let's move to the other side of the ball in this Florida game. You have anything else on the defense before I go?
Let's get to the fun part.
Well, I don't know if it's fun, Will, when you said season low in passing yards with 105 and total yards with 275. Florida entered the Georgia game with 350 plus total yards in 4 consecutive games here. So also 6 turnovers in the last 2 games for the Gators after he had only committed 6 in the first 5 games. Well, when you play a team that's going to be as good as Georgia is, you can't kill yourself. And while Florida did come back, they weathered the storm early. You have to kind of wonder if you hit that first flea flicker there. If you don't turn the ball over, maybe you could have built some kind of lead either to make Georgia fight back, and it's still a really close game toward the end, or or you put Georgia in a hole and they don't react too well. But these turnovers, especially the last 2 games when Florida was taking care of the ball so well in the first half of the season, has really reared its head these last 2 games.
Oh yeah, well, and I mean it's obviously tied to Franks.
Yeah.
I mean Franks has been sort of a turnover machine, and that continued yesterday. I think at one point he had 14 or 12 touchdowns and 2 picks or something like that, and now he's up around. Now he's at like 15 and 5 or 15 and 6 or something like that. So certainly that's changed a little bit over the last few games. But Florida only had 2 explosive plays. They had the 36-yard pass to Swain for a touchdown, and then there was a 20-yard run for Franks on a field goal drive to bring Florida within 6. Beyond that, they didn't have anything else. And so they averaged 3.9 yards per play without those explosive plays, which is interesting because Georgia also averaged 3.9 yards per play without their explosive plays. Problem is they had 8 explosive plays for 208 yards.
That was my worry. Well,
and that's where the the difference in the game is, right? I
Yeah.
mean, those explosive plays made it seem like Georgia was just flying up and down the field in the second half, and they were because they were getting them all in the second half. 7 of the 8 came from that last drive of the first half all the way to the end of the game. Um, this is something that I mentioned, and I wish I'd thought more about it maybe before this game, but it is something that I mentioned after the Vanderbilt game. That Vanderbilt was basically daring Florida to take 10, 12, 14 plays to drive down the field. And then Vanderbilt got impatient and they came up and they blitzed when Florida got into their territory. And that was when Florida hit the big plays. So the big run by Scarlett, a couple of throws by Franks. The touchdowns came from explosive plays once Vanderbilt came up and stopped playing zone and stopped playing more protective defense. And Georgia just never really
Mm-mm.
stopped doing that. They
Yeah,
just
they
sat
kept that
back and
safeties. Yeah, they kept their safeties too high almost the entire night.
and they let them self-destruct,
Yep.
right? So this is something that Franks is going to have to figure out. So he kind of figured it out on the touchdown pass to Swain, which was if you just let it rip as hard as you freaking can, then the safety can't get over
He
because
threw
he
that
threw.
ball, and I was like, "Oh no! Oh yeah, there we go."
Well, the funny part is, that's not the right read on the play. I don't think. I mean, the announcer's like, "Oh, he looked him off." And I'm like, "No,
No,
I
yeah,
don't think
I
that's where
saw it
that
from
ball's
the
supposed to go."
no, I saw it from the box. And I was like, "Oh no!" He just got it over, so it was a good
Well,
throw.
and he sort of lofted one on the almost the exact same play call in the first half, and it should have been intercepted. It just got knocked down by Georgia's safety. So this time he made sure it wasn't going to get intercepted, and he sort of short armed one to Morrill Stevens, I guess, earlier in the towards the end of the first half, and then this was his first real throw coming out in the second half, and it almost looked like Mullen had basically been like, "Let it rip," or "We're not going to let you let it rip anymore," and he certainly did. But I do take a little bit of an issue, and I mentioned this in the article that I wrote today that Mullen was really, really conservative in the second half,
Mhm.
and he wasn't near as conservative in the first half. I mean, the first half he's the flea flicker on the first play, and the 4th down and 1 where he's got the tight end sort of coming out against the linebacker. A lot of the things that we saw for Georgia's defense against LSU, where the linebackers weren't very disciplined, where the safeties were jumping things, we saw those in the first half. I mean, Van Jefferson got wide open because everybody came up on that running play to start the game, and it was open. So now you're not going to be able to come back to the exact same play, but the aggressiveness of the safeties are something that you can take advantage of. And it wasn't anything they ever did. I was really surprised they didn't try to run a reverse with Tony. They've been
Mhm.
running that a lot over the last 3 or 4 games. They didn't do that. They brought in Emory Jones
Yeah.
to basically run the Tony package, which was interesting. Um,
The swing
you know, I,
passes really weren't really there this game
well,
either.
and I mean, they're not going to be there when the defense is just playing
Yeah.
zone, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they'll be there for 4 or 5 yards. They're not going to
Yeah.
be there for if you don't get one-on-one. It's not going to do you any good throwing it out there. I mean, maybe you get 3 or 4 yards,
Yeah.
but I mean, there were a lot of times where they ran against fronts that were loaded. There were no, not necessarily loaded, but it was even, including the the back-breaking fumble of Franks coming out of the end zone. I mean, that was a 7-on-7, and Franks isn't a good enough runner to have one-on-one matchups up front and be running him out of the end zone.
Right.
And again, it's not a matter of thinking it's a terrible play call or you're blaming somebody else for the fumble. No, he has to hold on to the ball.
Yeah.
The problem that I have is that best case scenario, you come out of that 2nd and 7.
Yeah.
And then you got to throw the ball anyway, and you clearly don't want to throw the ball with him when you get him in 2nd and 3rd and long. I mean, that was pretty clear in the second half. And so, if that's the case, then you have to be more aggressive on running downs, and he just wasn't. And the one that really got me was the 3rd and 8 when they were sitting there ready for a 48-yard field goal, and they handed the ball off to Pirine so that they could have a 43-yard field goal. And it's like, like you, if you run the ball with Pirine, then you have to be going for it on 4th down. And if you're not going to go for it on 4th down, then you have to throw the ball on 3rd and 8. And if you don't have enough confidence in your quarterback to throw it on 3rd and 8 when you're in enemy territory, then he shouldn't be your quarterback. I mean, that's sort of the way, and maybe we're moving towards that, but you can't have somebody out there who you can't let it rip on 3rd and 8 when you're in the opposition's territory down 9 points. Like, you have to try to get a first down there. And the fact that they just handed the ball off to Pirine and were happy with the field goal, and 2 plays later, Georgia was back in field goal range, and it was like, well, even if they kick the field goal, they'll still be down 9 again, and 2 scores felt like a lot at that point. And then they hit Godwin for the touchdown, and the route was on.
Yeah, as you say, Will, I mean, of course, I think we can all, most of it can be pointed to Frank's here. Worst performance of the season, 13 to 21, 105 yards, one touchdown, one interception. And the one interception was terrible, too. He had P. Ryan open in the flat. I guess he didn't see the DB because it was well short of the receiver as well. That interception led to a Georgia score. Also, the fumble you mentioned inside the 1 yard line that, kudos to the defense for that defensive stand. I only kept it a field goal there, but still the worst imaginable place that you can have a turnover there. And the run game was there early for the most part in that first half. But either way, it was still going to have to be a game where Franks was going to have to play well when you're playing a team like Georgia. And he even said after the game, last year he would get defensive in the situation, but even he admitted it. He's got to be better. He was looking at the numbers. He says the numbers are right here. It's not good enough to win a big game like this. And Will, so while the game was still in reach in the fourth quarter, it was Georgia scoring 13 points in the final quarter, while Florida only scored 3. It was just a game. The Gators didn't really execute in the second half. Mullen called great plays in the first half and right after halftime as well to take the lead. Not much after that. Florida only had 55 yards in the fourth quarter when needing to respond. When Georgia went up by 12 around the 8-minute mark, the Gators went 3 and out, and then Georgia put on another touchdown to put the game away. And as ugly as it was, the Gators still had chances in the second half and kind of midway through the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that he needed to be fantastic. He just
No,
needed
no, no,
he
yeah,
just needed to not be awful.
yeah.
And the reality is, if you take away that 36-yard throw, he was 12 of 20 for 69 yards. So he averaged 3.5 yards per attempt.
And that means it's looking a lot like last year's game.
Well, which maybe I should take back some of my criticism then for for Mullen, because they were averaging more through the rushing than they were. So I think they averaged 4.6 for the game on the ground, and certainly they were going to have some success on the ground because Georgia was playing back in coverage and all those sorts of things. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's not good enough. Franks knows it's not good enough. Mullen knows it's not good enough. I'm just somebody who, when you're the underdog, go down chucking. I know you and I, because you were in the press box, we were able to text a lot during the game. And, after the field goal, which I didn't like the lack of aggressiveness there, after the field goal, they got the unsportsmanlike conduct penalty on Georgia and had the ball at the 50 to kick off. And they kicked that little pooch, which isn't a bad play last year when you couldn't fair catch the ball.
Yeah.
But this year, when you can fair catch the ball, it was just a waste. Like, you may as well try an onside kick there. Worst case scenario, Georgia gets the ball at the 40. You're not stopping them anyway. So what does it matter? And you get you get a shot to get the ball back with losing 15 yards of field position. To me, it seems like a great opportunity to do that, and he just didn't take that. He didn't take an aggressive tack there either. And if your quarterback is struggling the way Franks was, it was interesting. It felt like it was weird because he threw the touchdown to start the second half, and then he had the fumble in the end zone, and it felt very reminiscent of last year against Texas A&M, where he threw a touchdown or he threw an interception in double coverage, sort of rolling out to his right. There was a guy streaking who was wide open on his left, which I still contend he shouldn't be throwing the ball across his body like that. But anyway, launches the ball into the end zone. Ball gets intercepted. He's getting killed by McElwain on the sideline, and then just went into a shell. The rest of the game looked hesitant to throw the ball. The rest of that game, it kind of had that feel after the fumble in the end zone, where it was just like, all right, don't screw up, rather than let it rip. And if I screw up, we'll lose by 3 touchdowns instead of 2. They needed somebody who was going to come in and let it rip, and that just didn't happen.
All right. Well, we have a lot of our listeners out there sent their tweets in to get their reaction there. But of course, before we do that, I was at least the tailgating was fun at the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. Well, I got there at 7:45 in the morning. And I really needed that boost to get the day going, and I wanted it fast, so I got it going with Eagle Energy. And of course, I wanted to be focused when the game was going on, and Eagle Energy had me focused and ready to go. Eagle Energy is a plant-based caffeine inhaler that provides an effective and fast-acting energy boost via inhalation. I don't have time to wait on energy drinks to work, so that's why I go with Eagle Energy. Eagle Energy has no sugar, no calories, and the effects only take a few minutes with no jitteriness or that sudden crash. So on these busy game days or in your busy life, give Eagle Energy a try. Visit eagle.energy to learn more or to try Eagle Energy. Use promo code Gators20 and get 20% off your order. That's Eagle.energy to try a natural, longer lasting caffeine solution. Eagle Energy, energy reformed. And guys, of course, we know watching football is fun, but it's more entertaining when you have some action on these games. So, guys, you heard me talking about this for weeks, and some of you are still waiting to go bet with MyBookie. So, whether you're an expert or a rookie, that's where you should be betting at MyBookie. There's so much to bet on right now. We still have the World Series going on, basketball, hockey, and a huge UFC fight this weekend between Cormier and Lewis. I recommend MyBookie because I really trust them. MyBookie has been in the business for years. They've got great online reviews, and their mobile site is easy to use. And backed by popular demand, MyBookie is still going to offer the 100% bonus for one more week this year. That's right. Have you been thinking about placing that pick all season, but haven't done it yet? Well, now is your time to make that move. Also, make sure to follow MyBookie at BetMyBookie on Twitter or Instagram. They personally respond to every mention and DM. Not to mention, they've given away nearly $10,000 in free money to their followers this football season. You'll be the first to know as soon as new odds and props are posted. So log on to MyBookie right now. Don't miss out on your last opportunity to collect the industry's biggest bonus. Use promo code Gators and you'll get your first deposit matched 100%. That's promo code Gators. You play, you win, you get paid at MyBookie. Well, before we get into what our listeners thought of and their reaction, not to start a quarterback controversy or anything or the debate, but what did you think of Emory Jones going in there? Kind of a surprise with Dan Mullen. Emory Jones getting in some playing time, mostly runs. Of course, he had the fake run and a deep pass down to Van Jefferson that drew some a pass interference call from Georgia, but not necessarily something maybe we didn't necessarily expect. I did see during the week a couple message boards out there that this could happen, but it was when all the talk was Justin Fields getting some playing time. Jake Fromm got every snap for Georgia, but Emory Jones was inserted to maybe insert some kind of spark or just some creativity in this Florida offense.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have a problem with it. I didn't think it was, I didn't think it was like a fantastic cameo or anything. I mean, there was the play at the end of the half where he, if that pitch comes out a little bit earlier, then it looked like Scarlett had quite a ways to run.
Definitely.
So they didn't execute that one real well. He had a few nice runs of 7, 8 yards, things like that. But he doesn't look like a guy who's going to be breaking. I mean, I guess it depends on the defense that he's playing against. He looks like he's got skills like Fitzgerald, maybe a little bit faster, maybe a little bit smaller. But the deep throw was nice. Put it right on the guy's hands, and the pass interference was called. I mean, I don't think you can tell a whole lot by seeing a guy play 8, 9, 10 plays. The one thing I think is interesting is there's an opportunity cost when you bring in Emory Jones and give that package to him, because it takes it away from Kadarius Toney. Mm-hmm. And Toney has been far more explosive on the ground this year than he has been catching the ball. And so they did get it to Toney 3 or 4 times where he got receptions, but there was one where he's like falling out of bounds. They threw him a couple of bubble screens, and then on the 4th down play, they threw the ball behind him where they targeted him on the last play of the game, at least for Florida's offense. Toney's got to touch the ball 8, 9, 10 times a game in order to be effective. And by giving Jones those runs, you took it away from Toney. So the question is, do you think that Jones has the ability to break one long better than Toney? I don't know. I haven't seen enough of him to know that. What I would have liked to have seen, especially since there seemed to be a lack of trust with Franks, is that they run both packages.
Yeah.
Bring in Toney, let him have 2, 3 plays. Bring in Jones, let him have 2, 3 plays. They both have the capability of throwing the ball if you want to. So you can run some option plays. Even give them simple plays where you've got sort of a tight end who pretends to block and then drags across the formation, where everything's moving to the right and then you throw back to the left. And there wasn't a whole lot of misdirection yesterday at all, which really surprised me because of how aggressive Georgia's linebackers have been on tape. When you looked at them against LSU was really able, just like simple pitch plays to the outside. I know Florida ran one pitch play to Pirine that went for 12 yards. It was the only pitch I can remember in the entire game. So it was a weird.
Yeah, with the one speed option, I tweeted it. I said, "Oh, that play's been money all year." I think they only ran it maybe one more time and it got stuffed. But yeah, you're right. I don't remember seeing it a whole lot.
Well, they were ready for the speed option. They
Yeah.
didn't. The linebackers for Georgia, especially when they had the right guy on the field, I believe it was number 44. I can't remember what his name is, but when he was on the field, he's not fast enough to get to the outside, or he has to come so fast that he overruns it, and P. Ryan was able to cut back. So I was surprised that they didn't try to get the ball outside a little bit more with the running game while having the wide receivers block, as opposed to getting the ball outside to the receivers, and then Georgia was able to stymie that. But I think it's a little bit of the team wasn't executing real well, and so you get a little bit more conservative when you're concerned that they're not executing their core principles. Um, at the same time, I'm somebody who would like to see people open it up because I think aggression is the way to go. I mean, I'd say the same thing about Kirby. I was going nuts just looking at him. I mean, I liked it as a Florida fan, but the field goals that he was taking down in the red zone. I mean, the one where Florida had the goal line stand. I mean, even if you get stopped there, you're still up 6 points and you've got them pinned right where they were before. And maybe you get a pick from Franks or something stupid, or again something happens there as opposed to taking the field goal. Now it turned out not to matter, but it could have mattered. And he was very, very conservative throughout the game. I don't really agree with that, and I thought Mullen sort of did the same thing, and I think it cost Florida in some capacity. Now you still have to execute, and they weren't really executing well enough to win. But that was sort of my thought process through the whole game was that they weren't aggressive enough. And then that sort of tied in with Emory Jones. Bringing him in is a relatively aggressive move, but not if you're just giving Tony's carries to him. I would have liked to have seen it both ways.
All right, let's get your thoughts out there. All the thoughts that you sent for this reaction episode here. Mike Honcho says, I thought Franks played like he was afraid to make mistakes. He threw the ball worse than he has all season, looked tight the entire game. Unlike the rest of the games this year, Henderson going out hurt, but was proud of the effort. Goal line stand was unreal. And he wants to say, to clarify, I'm not a blame Franks or bench Franks guy right now. So, yeah, it is. I think a lot of this will is going to, be pinpointing on Franks and the struggles on offense there, rightfully so. For as big as the game as it was, your quarterback needed to play well in this game. Let's see. Scott Sweat says disappointed, but a top 10 matchup in year one was more than any of us expected. Anyway, a bad game for coach to suspend the starter, but it shows what the standard is. Injuries and depth ultimately cost, but a 10-win season would be a huge success. But this game does sting a bit. Well, I guess it is kind of interesting. This game is going to sting for the players. There was the thought there, some of the players out there thought it was said they were too confident, and I think when you go back and look at it after a game, it's kind of a convenient excuse. There was was told that the team practiced well all week, kind of ready for this game. I don't think they were overconfident. They can say they were. I guess we'll take their word for it, but it's just, I guess, how do you rebound? How do you rebound from this game? We'll see if Henderson can come back when you have Missouri coming up. They're probably going to need him going against that passing attack. But it's all about and it has been announced it will be a 4:00 game versus Missouri on the SEC network. So no noon game. So it'll be a 4:00 kickoff versus Missouri. But it's all about how these Gators bounce back after this Georgia game.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to take a step back in two capacities. One is remember how Fromm struggled against LSU 2 weeks ago, and the chatter with Georgia was it needs to be Fields, it needs to be Fields, it needs to be Fields. Give him a shot. Fromm can't do it, and then Fromm comes out and plays lights out, right? So
Nick Fitzgerald the same way, and comes out and blows out Texas A&M.
Yeah, I mean, so you don't ever want to judge a quarterback by his worst game or by one bad game. And everybody coming into this game was saying, hey, Franks has played pretty well this year. Mm-hmm. He's getting better. Every game he seems to have gotten better, seems to make better decisions. He took a step back against a really good defense. I don't think we want to sugarcoat it and say, hey, it was a great performance. But I think people calling for his benching are sort of taking last year in aggregate compared to, looking at yesterday and saying, oh, this is the same stuff we saw last year. And in some capacity it is. But he's been a much better quarterback this year than he was last year, and I think we need to acknowledge that. Now, one thing I will say is that before the season started, I went and looked and said, okay, Mullen had Prescott in year one who struggled. somewhat 10 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, a QB rating of 127. In year 2, he increased to 27 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, and a QB rating of 152. All right, so if you take those same percentages and apply it to Frank's, from year 1, he had 9 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. If he had the same percentage increase as Prescott, he'd get to 24 and 13, and his QB rating would be 137. Well, lo and behold, he's at 16 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and his QB rating is 139. So he's exactly who we should expect him to be based on sort of Mullen's effect on quarterbacks. Now, the bad news is in year 3, Prescott put up the exact same QB rating as he did in year 2. So this may be his ceiling. And so the question is that ceiling good enough to keep other players off the field? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But, I hesitate to pile on Franks for one bad game because we just saw people pile on Fromm for one bad game.
Yeah.
And then Fromm comes out and lights up a really good defense. I mean, Florida's been a really good defense all year, and he completely torched them. And so, I think that what we're going to find is when they're playing against teams like Missouri who can't stop anyone, Franks is going to look a lot better. And it's not going to be because Franks all of a sudden turned into a different player. It's going to be because he's not playing against Florida's defense or against Georgia's defense.
All right. Let's see. Highway 20 Gator says, or HWY, maybe that stands for highway, but HWY 20 Gator. Hard loss to accept. Our issues with our secondary may cost us again this weekend. Drew Lock has the ability to pick us apart. They will game plan against us off of what UGA was successful with in the passing game. My confidence is low. Heavy Metal Gator. It sucks, but the opportunity was there to win the game. I thought Mullen outcoached Kirby by a large margin. I just don't have the roster yet where it needs to be. The Gators are on the right track for big things in the future. Go Gators. Well, that was the thought, and I think we'll probably see a few more here kind of saying that same thing. Even though it was a loss, it was a 19-point loss. Some Gator fans are not down in the dumps after this game, as we mentioned. It was a game going into the fourth quarter, a little while into the fourth quarter. You had your chances. You had you hit the flea flicker on the first play of the game. Maybe some injuries don't happen. It's a different game. We won't ever know that. But I think the realization, kind of in a different way after the Kentucky game, saying the recruiting needs to be better, the roster needs to be better. We've seen the indictment on Jim McElwain recruiting. This is not an indictment on Dan Mullen. It's the roster that's he was dealt with and making the most out of right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you'd come into so after the Kentucky game, I think if you'd have told me that we'd be 6-2 at this point, I'd be like, absolutely, I will take that and stamp it right now. And I think most Florida fans would be deluding themselves if they said they wouldn't have been the exact same way to take 6-2 coming out of the Georgia game in a game that Florida looked
and favored probably the rest of the season
in a game that Florida looked competitive in, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning of the year, like I picked them to go 7-5. Most people picked them to go 8-4, and I think we would have all said 9-3 is overachieving. Well, barring something weird, that they're probably going to end up there pretty easily. I mean, the Idaho game should be a definitive win, and then they should, like you said, they should be favored against Missouri, South Carolina, and Florida State. So if they get to 9-3, it's a successful year. Now, yeah, recruiting has to improve, and we've been talking about that since May, and sort of been pointing it out, and pointing out where Florida stands and and some of the issues they've had bringing in guys from California and all that sort of stuff. And, it still needs to improve based on where it is right now. I think they're behind maybe 14 teams on a average basis for the 24/7 composite. And, 12 to 15th ranked recruiting class probably isn't going to get you to a place where you can beat Georgia unless you have an absolute stud at quarterback. And it's possible that one of these guys will be that at some point, but it's also possible they won't. And I don't know that we necessarily want to rely on that. And it's the same place in the defensive backfield. I mean, if you look at the projected starting DBs this year, they would have averaged 3.8 stars, 222 national ranking, and 2.4 years of experience. And you look at the guys who essentially were there after Henderson was left as the starters, they averaged 3.4 stars, 558 was the national ranking, and 2.2 in terms of experience. So the national ranking went down by about 330. The years of experience decreased by a quarter of a year, and the star rating went down by almost a half a star. So yeah, there's less talent, but it was also less experience. I mean, they were younger guys who were in there playing.
Yeah, there are not a lot of upperclassmen defensive backs on this Florida team right now.
No, it is a lot of sophomores.
Yeah, they may pay dividends next year, but yeah, you're right. What Florida's playing with right now, There's not a lot of experience right there, and then it was and it really showed with a. And look, I even said going into the game in part of my preview, I wanted to see wide receivers versus DBs on both sides, and little did I know that deep Georgia receiver core would be going to get so inexperienced Florida secondary.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Georgia had 4 receivers who, coming out of high school, ranked in the top 33 players in the nation. So Isaac Nada was 14th. Terry Godwin was 27th. DeAndre Swift was 33rd. And obviously, he's a running back, but he catches the ball to the backfield a lot too. And then Mecole Hardman was 12th. So lose your best 2 corners and tell me who's going to guard those guys.
Yeah.
I mean, Godwin caught a touchdown pass. Holloman caught a touchdown pass. He's 125th. Riley Ridley caught a touchdown pass. He's 248th. Werner, who's the backup tight end, was 138th for his national ranking. So, I mean, the guys that Florida's DBs were being asked to guard are people who are highly, highly skilled. And, that's when the depth is going to get exposed. Again, I don't necessarily know that it was strictly just the injuries that caused some of the issues in the secondary. And the reality is it doesn't matter. I mean, you have to be ready to step up. But what I will say is that, everybody who talks about coaching or recruiting, I mean, it's both, right? Yeah. Like, you have to bring in high-level recruits, and then you have to coach them. And I'll be honest, I come out of this game confident that if Mullen has equivalent talent to Kirby Smart, Mullen's going to win the lion's share of those games.
Yeah.
But he didn't have equivalent talent, and it showed. And so Florida, wasn't able to overcome some of those injuries and had to get conservative on both sides of the ball due to some of the limitations that they have.
Yeah, not to beat the horse, beat the dead horse on Stars Matter, but most of the time, and we've said it before here, when we say it, it doesn't necessarily mean the starting 22. It's who you fill them in with, and that's that's what we got. So, firing season, Gator Cowboy fan says turnovers can't get behind double digits versus an elite team because 13 isn't built to come from behind. Like I said, Florida did come back eventually and take the lead, but like I said, without those turnovers, maybe Florida could have built a lead and made Georgia come back from behind. He also says defensive line, defensive back, offensive line still needs to be recruited at a high level. Stephen OHL says optimistic. The game plan was working, coaching was there, the players just didn't execute. Finish the season 10-2. Work on recruiting. We'll be there next year. Gator Bodine says, after reading Will's post-game article, I feel differently about the conservative play calling. Why does Mullen put so much on his struggling Franks? Mullen is stubborn, where it was Tony. Use all your weapons. Still feel good overall, but Mullen can improve as well. So, Will, you said there, always the case after a loss. I don't blame Mullen. Just don't want people to only blame the players.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the long and short of it. Is when you look at it, there are things that Mullen probably could have done better, and I think he'll admit that, maybe in a private moment. And I think there are things the players could have done better, and they'll have to admit that as well. And even special teams, which has been a real strength for Florida. One of the things I pointed out in my article was at the end of the first half, the field completely flipped on a punt. It was a really nice punt by Georgia's kicker. I think it was 57 yards. Mm-hmm. David Reese, one of the starters who's out there on the kick return, was called for a hold. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, Florida's got the ball at the 15. Well, you put your team, Georgia punted the ball from the 20, so you kind of expect to get it in like the 35 or 40 range, maybe worst case. And instead, they're at the 15, and so they were more conservative. They didn't get it out. They got it out to about the 35, and then that was when Jones threw the pitch that got knocked down. So they're punting from their own 30. Tommy Thompson, or the Florida's punter, was able to get the ball all the way into the end zone for a touchback. But at that point, still, because of sort of the conservative play calling, there was a little bit of time for Georgia. They were able to drive it down the field and go up by 6 going into the half. And like I said, I think found something on that drive. So, the special teams yesterday weren't fantastic. The offense was definitely not fantastic, and the defense struggled too. And whenever you have that combination, it's going to be tough to win.
All right, last few thoughts here from you out there. The goal line stand showed me everything I need to know about this team. Still so much left to achieve this year. 10 wins would be amazing. Give Dan Mullen a couple recruiting cycles, and we'll be whipping Georgia in no time. So, yeah, that goal line stand was, still saw the fight there from the team, and still kept a minute to hold Georgia to a field goal there. Ken Tillery says, absolutely hoping and believing for a win, but still impressed with where we are, considering at the beginning of this season we were expected to repeat the beating we took from Georgia last year. Mullen has us way ahead of schedule. Here we go, Will. From a hashtag couch tweeter perspective, the team hung tough with more talented Georgia team for 3 quarters. At 23-17, the game was there to be had. Props to Georgia for taking control. Disappointed, yes. Upset, no. Swamp should be packed next week. Go Gators. And that's part of it, too. Like I said, when it came down to it, later in the game, Georgia made the plays and Florida couldn't, mostly behind the arm of Fromm there. Willie also said his last sentence: Swamp should be packed next week. Hey, you'll be at the Missouri game next week.
Yes, sir. I am excited that it's a 4 p.m. game so that I can
Yeah.
actually tailgate or do something before the game as opposed to having to go to a nooner. But no, it's gonna be fun. I was when we were trying to figure out what game to go to. This wasn't one that we thought was going to be real telling on the schedule. But I'll be honest, I'm really curious to see how Florida comes out and whether they come out a little bit listless after this because because they're disappointed from the performance, or whether they come out angry and sort of put it on Missouri. So hopefully it'll be the latter, and certainly if anybody's there and wants to chat, let me know, and I'd be glad to come by and talk about the Gators, because that's always fun to do.
Absolutely, I'll be there too. So you can, everybody can hang out with Will and I. We can talk some Gator football and hang out in a different atmosphere than here on YouTube and all these cyber places here. So here we go. Stomp Lock in the Swamp says this team holding strong even with not clicking on all cylinders. Mullen showing Justin Fields what he's missing out on. Georgia fans were worried 3/4 of the way through the game. Not what I wanted this game, but definitely more than I expected this year, with a chance to still win out. And Gatorbait03 says disappointed, but I feel if we didn't turn it over and hit the wide open guy to start the game, we win. With that being said, I think we would have finished with a similar record, whether win yesterday or not. Now we don't have to worry about playing Bama and still be 10-2. And last one, Chris Whelan says, obviously disappointed losing to a rival, but the score didn't show how close the game was. Florida is way ahead of schedule in the Mullen era rebuild, and with 10 into a real possibility, it's hard to complain. And like I said, Will, most fans, losing to Georgia sucks. Don't get me wrong. There's no solace in losing to Georgia, but playing a top 10 team, a team that's probably going to be around top 5 as well. Seeing how it all played out, it was not a blowout. Florida was in the game for most of the time. There is a lot to take away positively from this game as well, when you look at it as a whole.
Yeah, I don't know, man. There's no moral victories in the SEC.
That's right.
You either win the East or you don't. You either win the SEC or you don't. And that's one of the reasons Jim McElwain's gone, is because he was able to win the East those 2 years, but he clearly didn't have a team that could compete for a championship. And his recruiting was part of that. And that's why he got jettisoned, along with sort of the weird death threats and the shark memes and all that sort of stuff. But and the same thing will happen to Mullen if he's not able to win some of these games. Now, he's proven an ability to win games at Mississippi State that maybe Mississippi State shouldn't have won. And I think the game plan yesterday, particularly in the first half, gives me hope that he's going to be able to do that in the future. But this was also one thing I do think we need to take into account is this was the year to get Georgia with the two running backs with Chubb and Michelle and all those guys that they lost, and Fromm coming in struggling, and the way he played in the first quarter and 3/4 of the second quarter. I mean, this was an opportunity for them to get him, and they didn't. They let him off the hook. And I hope, I don't think this is going to be the case, but I hope that isn't something that reverberates 2, 3, 4 years from now, where they had an opportunity to get him. It could have changed some of the momentum in recruiting, could have taken Florida. I think Bill tweeted before the game that if Florida won that game, it wasn't just going to be that they were competing for the East, so that they were competing for even in the national picture, but that Florida was back. And that narrative isn't there today because of the end result. Again, I'm not disappointed that the team lost. I'm just looking at it objectively and saying, Georgia's linebackers were struggling not because they were not talented. They were struggling because they were young. And we saw this in 2007 with Florida's defense. After the 2006 team, a bunch of those guys left. And then 2007, those guys couldn't stop anybody. And then 2008, they stopped everybody. And one of my concerns is that with the amount of talent that's coming into Georgia, they'll be able to do that. Now, Kirby has not necessarily impressed me with some of his in-game coaching. We'll see what his development skills are now that he's bringing his own players in. Maybe he's not real good at that, and Mullen will be better at it than him, and all of a sudden Florida will be equivalent in a year or two, and we'll forget that this conversation ever happened. But this was the year to get Georgia, and so it's a little bit disappointing coming out in that sense. But like I said, if you'd have told me after the Kentucky game that Florida would be 6-2 after this game, it would have been competitive through 3 quarters with Georgia, I would have definitely taken it then.
All right, well, let's take a look around the SEC right quick before we get off here on this episode of Gators Breakdown. Vanderbilt beats Arkansas 45-31. Not much to look at there, of course. Georgia 36-17 over Florida. And one of the weirder comebacks, you will see, Kentucky comes back, storms back, scores 12 points in the fourth quarter, and wins the game at the buzzer to beat Missouri 15-14 and sets up a winner-take-all for the SEC East with Kentucky and Georgia next weekend.
I gotta be honest, man. With Trump as president, if Kentucky wins the SEC East, I'm like building a bunker somewhere. Like if you'd have told me Kentucky was going to win the East and Trump would be president 10 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. So I mean, I'm going to be rooting for Kentucky because I'm just anti-Georgia all the time. But I am worried that an asteroid is heading for us if Kentucky wins that game.
Yeah, as ugly as it has looked the last couple of weeks, they have found a way to win. We'll see if they can do it again when Georgia travels to Lexington and the winner wins the SEC East there. Mississippi State, Nick Fitzgerald, as I said, 241 yards passing after all the questions of him, and also led the team with 88 yards rushing. Good for him to respond the way he did, and Mississippi State gets a 28-13 victory over number 16 Texas A&M. And Will Muschamp is still undefeated against Tennessee. 27-24. South Carolina beats Tennessee as South Carolina scored 18 in the second half, while Tennessee only scored 10. It looked like Tennessee was on their way of winning this game, but they got shut out in the fourth quarter, and South Carolina scored 18 points in the second half to come away with the victory. And Will Muschamp just knows how to beat Tennessee.
Well, he couldn't beat anybody else when he was at Florida. So, no, I mean, he's always been a really good recruiter. I think if you're happy with 8-4, then he's probably your guy. I look forward to seeing the types of things that Mullen's going to be able to do to exploit the Gamecocks.
Yep, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Clemson put it on FSU.
I wasn't sure if you were going to bring that up. I was going to, that's for sure. Thank goodness that game was at noon, because then we got to torture the fans before our game came up.
Exactly. 59-10 Clemson.
I got to be honest, it could have been a lot worse. Yeah. Like the first quarter was just sort of Clemson feeling out Florida State, and man, once they figured out they had them, it was just
28
bomb after
points.
bomb after bomb.
Man, so 28 points in the second quarter for Clemson.
Oh man, well, the Clemson fans are not missing Kelly Bryant right now. That is for sure. Yeah. And the ACC is really terrible. Yeah. The Walmart in Tallahassee is not selling out of backpacks. Put it that way. They are none too pleased with their coach up there, and none too pleased with the record. And he went in after the game and said some of his players had quit, and that's a pretty aggressive accusation to be making in your first year. 8 games in, to be calling out your players for quitting. So I don't know. Again, I'm disappointed in the Georgia loss, but at least that's not us.
Yeah, at least that is not us. Exactly. So, I'm going to have Will Blackman on, I think, tomorrow. He's going to join me, and we had him on during the Tennessee week. So Will's going to join me, and he writes for Saturday Down South. So he'll come in and share his thoughts. Thomas Goldcamp is going to try and come on. He'll have media duties with the team and their practice tomorrow night. So we'll send the link to him, and if he can join in, he's going to join in as well to get his thoughts from Florida, Georgia, and moving ahead to Missouri.
No, that'll be great. I look forward to hearing what those guys say. And, Thomas obviously is pretty close to the team, so sort of hearing his temperature of what's going on will be really interesting. Particularly, I know the fans are clamoring for a backup quarterback, but it'll be interesting to hear the perspective from the team, because I'm guessing that nothing much is going to change there, but it'll be interesting to hear.
Yeah, we'll definitely hit more of the whole Frank's Emory Jones. I don't think there's no controversy to me, but then we'll see if Emory deserves more snaps and see where it goes from there. I'll get those guys' thoughts on what needs to happen and so far this season and bouncing back after Georgia. Will, anything else, man?
No, man. I guess I just it's one of those things where it's disappointing, but it's not backbreaking really in terms of what we thought the year would be. And I'm still proud of the team and the way they played. That goal line stand was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of those moments where just you were really proud of the team and the way they held up. And Mullen coming out on the field and acting like a maniac to get the unsportsmanlike conduct penalty and setting them right back up to where they were, and wondering, Kirby took the field goal to go up by 9, and you're just like, oh, please let that cost them, please, because it's so damn conservative. It's such an idiotic play. But hey, sometimes you fall short. I think this was one before the season that we all thought probably was going to be one where Florida fell short. It happened, but again, like I said, 6-2 after 8. That we would have taken that to start the year, and certainly the capacity to finish it off 10-2. Hopefully Florida will be able to finish that out, and it'd be a really impressive season if they do.
Absolutely, still been fun. It's still been fun. Most of the day was fun yesterday. Tailgating scene was a 10, as always, as Florida Georgia is. So yeah, you mentioned the later arriving crowd there on the Florida side, and that's kind of been a tradition for Florida Georgia. As the Georgia side always fills in first. I did get a lot of complaints from the Florida side that some fans waited in line for an hour to get through metal detectors and all that stuff. So you got to figure that stuff out. But of course, safety first. But sometimes Georgia fans didn't really have a problem getting their side filled in pretty quick. So.
Well, I mean, there was apparently an incident after the game down in Jacksonville.
There was.
So
some guy, somebody shot themselves and passed away. So yeah, so scary thing is we had a shooting here in Jacksonville, close to the stadium with the Jaguar game going on, and then after the game, Florida Georgia as well. So yeah, not something you want to be talking about on at all. But of course, on game day when so many people were in that concentrated area.
Yeah, well, and certainly after the esports incident that happened a couple of months ago and all that sort of stuff, I'm sure there was increased security. And they did actually make a point of mentioning it on the broadcast that the Florida side had some issues with security getting in. So they at least made sure that Dan Wolken wouldn't take a shot at the fan base.
And a jet flying overhead right now, but yeah, the Blue Angels were cool yesterday, flying over. So that was cool to see. It's getting to see the Blue Angels do the flyover for the game.
Yeah, they had the blimp up above it for the telecast. That was kind of cool to see them going over the stadium from above. But hey, this game is so much fun. It's so much fun to watch. I love the 50-50 in the stadium and all that sort of stuff. I know there's been some discussion about home and all that sort of stuff. And certainly I know you don't want it to move because you just get to wake up and drive downtown.
Right. But, I woke up at 6:30, was parking at 7:45.
Oh man, that'd be nice. I got to get on a plane just to get there next week. But, it'll be fun. There's anytime I feel bad about a loss or anything like that, I just need to go back and listen to one of our episodes from last year after Texas A&M or LSU or Georgia or Missouri, and I'm immediately in a good mood because it's like the Mullen era is so much better than anything we experienced last year, and I look forward to see what he's going to do the rest of the year.
All right, well, that's for sure. So we won't get this be your only episode this week. So we'll get to talk to you next time I talk to you. It will be in person when we see you here. May get to see you Thursday in Jacksonville. If not, definitely on game day Saturday morning in the swamp.
Hey man, looking forward to it.
All right, that's Will Miles. You can find him on Twitter at Will Miles SEC and his site readandreaction.com. You can go back and read his thoughts and his breakdown of the Florida Georgia game. And I'm your host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.